And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us, and one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it, and that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tales. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. Tonight's episode, we're going to be joined by my guest, Alan and Kim Bishop. They are distillers. They also have a podcast called If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything. I talked to Alan back in the springtime. Had a great conversation with him. Wanted to have him come on my show. Talk with him tonight. But before we bring them on, if you've ever had an experience and you would like to be on an episode of Tinfoil Tales, there's a couple things you can do. You can either send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to tinfoiltales.com and go to the contact section. Just make sure to reach out to me and we'll get something scheduled for a future episode. If you'd like to help the podcast out, please share it around. Word of mouth helps the podcast grow. You can also leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to Tinfoil Tales at. You can also join the Patreon. Because if you're like me and you don't like hearing all the ads, on the Patreon, you get early access to all the episodes and they're all ad-free. There's a paid tier and a free tier. The paid tier is only $1.99 a month. It's worth checking out if you're interested in helping support Tinfoil Tales. You can find more information about that in the show notes. Make sure to follow me on all the social medias. And if you're interested in wearing some Tinfoil Tales gear, make sure to reach out and get something arranged. But we are going to go ahead now and bring on Alan and Kim, dive into the conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take this time to welcome my guests tonight, Alan and Kim. Thanks for coming on here and talking to me.
Absolutely.
Would you like to let the audience know a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Alan Bishop. I call myself the Alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest. I know that sounds ridiculous, and it should sound ridiculous. I make fun of myself for it. But that title is part and parcel to my spirituality and also to my career. I'm a distiller in southern Indiana in a place that used to be known as the Black Forest, which would be Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry counties. It was once the capital of apple brandy production for not only the United States, but for the entire world. And I distill for a living currently and permanently now, I hope, at Old Homestead Distillery out at Patoka Lake here in southern Indiana, right in the middle of the Hoosier National Forestry, which has got a ton of stories around it, and we're hoping to collect some more of those. But in addition to that, I do a lot of distilling education, and I write an almanac that includes the Fortean and sort of the occult, but is catered towards distillers mostly. And we run another podcast that we call If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything. That would be Kim, my wife, and myself. And I will let her do her intro because I'm not sure how she wants to be introduced.
Well, I'm much less interesting than Alan. I am a stay-at-home mom, and I guess folk readings online and occasionally in person locally, and chief chauffeur and chef in the house.
Chaos coordinator.
Chaos coordinator.
That's it.
Yes.
Yes. It's a great title.
Part of that cut out from her. I don't know if it's the internet or what, but your voice cut out.
Okay. There might be a short in the soundboard. Have you got me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
And I also leaned back. That could have probably did it too.
Yep. You got to face that mic because you don't have a boom stand. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want me to redo it or what? Are you good with it?
I mean, I'm good with it. There's like maybe 5 seconds where there was just silence, so I could just.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
I will try not to lean back. I talk with my hands though, so I'm an animated talker.
I do very little editing, so when this episode airs, we're probably going to hear this part of it too.
No, it's all good.
That's fine.
It's all good. We try to handle if you have ghosts the same way most of the time, unless somebody slips up and says something they're not supposed to, and then and then we cut it out. But
Right.
but
For the most
otherwise-
part, I try and leave everything as authentic as possible. So
Yep.
that is how I go about it. And sometimes I've had to go here recently because there were certain words that were used that I didn't want in the show because it will actually get me flagged and kicked off
Mhm.
certain platforms because there's certain words you can't say these days.
yeah,
And they're not
Yep.
bad words, but for some reason they're deemed bad words.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and we same as you being as authentic as you can with your editing. That's kind of how we live our life. I mean, who we are and what we do with the podcast and our various platforms and all that stuff. None of it is character driven necessarily. It's all just an extension of who we are. I mean, we live the old school distillers lifestyle here in Southern Indiana, which includes, farm distilling and a deep reverence for all things spiritual and supernatural. And, we've just started to lean into that a little bit more publicly in the past few years. And that's what our podcast, If You Have Ghosts, grew out of, was hearing all kinds of other distillers and knowing the history of distilling in Indiana, people talking about their paranormal experiences at their distilleries and hoping to provide a platform to those people to tell their stories. But it turns out it's a whole lot harder to get distillers to come forward and talk about their stories than we thought. So it's transformed into all kinds of stories over the years. But it's all interrelated as far as we're concerned with the alchemy and her green witchery and my hermetic gnostic philosophy, and they're all part of the same overall thing, and it's all an authentic piece of who we are.
What led you to all this? Like, has it something you were familiar with from an early age, or is it something that you were just drawn into?
The distilling part of it, I've been around my whole life. So my family, they all came from Kentucky, from Oneida, Kentucky, which is down in eastern Kentucky, Clay County. And then my dad's family, they came up from Greene County, Kentucky, and they bought a farm here in Pekin, Indiana. They moved up here to get jobs at the Kimball's factory. It was called Borden Cabinet Factory back in the day, because there were no jobs in Greensburg. And when they bought the farm, they also decided that they would raise tobacco. For a few years, they raised chickens and stuff. And they also, made moonshine on the side. My mom's family, much more so than my dad's family. But I grew up in what I call a family of vice here in Southern Indiana, or as we like to call it, Hoosier occupied Northern Kentucky, which you abbreviate it, spells honky, which is kind of funny, but and fitting at the same time. But we raised tobacco and we made moonshine because that's how we paid for property taxes and paid for Christmas gifts. And as far as the spiritual, the paranormal, the supernatural, and all that stuff, my family being from Kentucky, they had a long history with that stuff. There's a story about the time that my great grandfather, quote unquote, met the devil, that's traveled in our family for a long time, that always stuck with me. And then, being from Eastern Kentucky, there's a lot of, hill folk knowledge. But for example, my grandma Bishop, my dad's mom, she was as Baptist as they could come, but she did things and she knew things that I didn't realize as a child. And I spent a lot of time with her. I didn't realize as a child that what she was doing would be considered like granny witchery. She knew about herbs, and she knew about their medical uses, and she knew about the spiritual realm, and she knew all this folklore essentially. And if she were alive and she heard me call it granny witchery, she'd smack the hell out of me, without a doubt. But that's what she was doing. She was doing stuff that was passed down, like old cunning folk traditions from England that were passed down through her family that I'm sure she didn't even know, what the origins were. But like a great example would be You wouldn't call it spell work, but it's not spell work. You go through the book of Psalms and you find something that fits what you're looking for, what you're asking for, and so that becomes almost like a spell in the way that you're saying it or repeating it like a mantra, or like with divination, she'd do bibliomancy. So she might wake up and flip through a Bible with her eyes closed and point at some random passage and then open her eyes, and then that's how she was sort of looking at, well, what's going to happen in the near term future, or what's coming down the pike, as it were. And it didn't occur to me until much later that that's exactly what she was doing. So I grew up around all that, and then the undercurrent here as well. And Kim's family's been here in Washington County, Indiana, since about 1812 or so. So they have very deep roots here. But this region itself is sort of magical in many ways. The six county region and some of the other counties surrounding it are pretty interesting. Most of the people who settled here were of German ancestry. Now they would have come, out of Maryland and out of Virginia and out of the Carolinas, etc., to get here. But those Germans, those Black Forest Germans, they held on to a lot of their folklore and a lot of their magic, and it got ingrained in many ways within the very landscape of where we live at. It's just to the degree that some of those concepts you might even consider tulpas, like they were spoken into existence because people talked about them so frequently.
Right.
And then that's also meshed up against a little bit of Scots Irish and a little bit of Welsh here. And then a lot of what people don't realize is still old French influence from the fur trapping days. There's loop guru legends and all that stuff here in southern Indiana. They're a little hard to find. You got to really dig to get to them, but they left an impression on the landscape, as did the Adena and the Hopewell and what they used to call the Southern Death Cult. It's now called the Southern Ceremonial Complex is what it's called, but it was the mound builders in this region, and they were tied into the Mesoamericans, all the way down to grottos and human sacrifice, and the whole nine yards was all happening here where we're at. And people don't realize the depth of history and haunted history and Fortean history here in Indiana, because we have this sort of concept that nothing good could ever possibly come from Indiana. I'm pretty sure that we're the only state. I'll give you an example. I'm pretty sure we're the only state where the following happens. Nothing good or cool could have ever happened here, could ever possibly happen in the future, right? We don't have any real cool culture or anything like that. We have people who were born in this state who never left this state to go to school and whose family has been here since, the 1800s. And yet somehow they have a UK basketball placard somewhere on their vehicle, right? It's pretty sure this is the only state where that happens. I don't think that happens anywhere else. So, and it's a shame because we have every bit as deep a history as any other state has. It's a little bit different. We were part of the Western frontier. I mean, we had Johnny Appleseed. How cool is that, right? We got here in Washington County, Indiana, we've got the burial site for Micaiah Calloway. And Micaiah Calloway is a great American folk hero who nobody knows the name of. He was Daniel Boone's forward scout. This was the guy that was going out 20, 30 miles out in front of Daniel Boone and reporting back to him and saying things like, well, you don't want to go that way. I don't know what's on that other trail over there, but you don't want to go on the one that I went down. So there's all that stuff is here, and it all feeds into the culture, the folklore, the ghosts that haunt the landscape here. There's land spirits. The town that we live in, there's been a lot of high strangeness in the past, stuff that we thought that only us and our neighbors experienced, but we found out later on that other friends of ours in different parts of town had experienced. It's an interesting place. You have to be attuned to it. You have to be paying attention to catch it all. And you have to be able to sort of, thread the needle to put it all together and sort of see the bigger picture with it. So
one of the things I just thought of, and it's completely my 88 HD brain over here, but when you were mentioning like Daniel Boone is scouting the trails and everything, I had this image of what Indiana would have looked like without all the cornfields. And was it all foresty areas?
It was. It
So,
was.
like, was the whole state basically like big forest? And I think, like, even most of the country, if you think about it, like, I feel like a lot of this area was all covered in trees. So there's a lot of trees that got cut down during this whole time frame.
Well, and that part of that's related to distilling, but so most of our old growth hardwood from Indiana, I'll tell you where it's at right now. If you ever go through any of the river towns on the Ohio River, Mississippi River, go down to New Orleans, Louisiana, and you see shotgun houses.
Mm-hmm.
Those are old flatboats that came out of Indiana and Kentucky and Ohio and Pennsylvania and all those places. That's all of our old growth timber. But when we were the Western Front and this was surveyed, uh, the forest was crazy. So there are these tales of, for example, chestnut trees that were the size of redwoods, and the understory tree was sugar maple, and they were 60 foot tall at the first branch, for example. Huge conifer trees. The area just a little bit west of us over towards Campbellsburg, Indiana, and you get over towards Harrison County, Indiana. They called the trails that went through there, they called them the airlock because they said it was like going into a tunnel or into a cave. And they said it was just miserable in the summertime because even though it was shaded, all the heat that was there was trapped. It couldn't go anywhere. There wasn't any wind or anything through there anywhere. But it was also cleared out because the natives here in the area were practicing this sort of wild agriculture in some ways. I don't really know how you would say it because it's not even like planned like the way that Europeans would plan agriculture, but they're just taming the landscape to some degree, right? And selecting for things that they can find in the wild to eat. And so there were no, they kept everything very clean. There was no real underbrush or anything of that nature. But when we say Black Forest of Southern Indiana, it was literally a forest. And part of that still exists in the Hoosier National Forestry and the DNR regions, and even even more towards civilization where we're at. We're about 30 minutes north of Louisville. There's not huge tracts of woods. There are some, but there's a lot of large patches of broken woods. So it's still pretty heavily forested. And I just came to the realization this last fall, one thing that I've always missed here in Southern Indiana and never thought of, just with the wild trees alone and paying attention to what grows. This whole place is an orchard. The whole place is an orchard, truly. Between the nut trees and the persimmon trees and the wild peaches and, the pawpaw trees and all that stuff, it's all a giant orchard.
I feel like there's so much going on with Indiana, and it's the flyover state, thanks to
Right.
that country song. But for me, it's I've always heard about the weird stuff that goes on around here,
Mhm. Mhm.
but you don't hear anyone outside of Indiana really mention Indiana.
No, you don't. You really don't, unfortunately. And even on other podcasts, I mean, Southern Indiana stories in particular, and Northern Indiana, I think, is the same way. But you rarely hear those stories on podcasts, and I don't know if that's just Hoosiers have this tendency to be a little bit solitary in everything that they do to some degree. And I'm not entirely sure what that comes from or what that is. We're a little clannish, kind of like Eastern Kentucky. I think especially down here in the southern part of the state, traditionally we've all been very tight. And so there's certain things that you don't say to everybody or you don't tell everybody, but they float around locally. And then we also, unfortunately, one of the things I've run into with my love of folklore and my love of collecting these stories and telling them through If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything is Indiana State University has got a huge collection of folklore, but it's not available to the public.
Indiana State or IU Bloomington?
Well, altogether, the whole thing is,
Okay.
yeah, but IU Bloomington, yeah. It's not available to the public. It's off limits. If you're not part of the program, you can't get to it. And that sort of aggravates me because it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to all of us. There's an archive, for example, out of Evansville and Vincennes of old French legends. And the vast majority of them, several hundred pages worth, are not available to anyone. They have it in their archive, but it's not available to anybody. And so if somebody has an experience now with something strange, where are they going to go and be able to even find the information about whether or not something like that has happened in the past and someone's reported it? And oftentimes that old folklore is where it was reported at.
Right. You mentioned several times, and I was going to mention it. I was waiting till you're done talking, but the Indiana, like the forest, the national forest, I've been told within the last 2 weeks that I need to come down there because of, you'd mentioned basically for the terms for everyone listening, werewolves. The French version is the rougarou, but that is what I was told to go down there for because of all these reports of werewolves and dogmen type things in the forest. I said, well, for starters, it's pretty far for me to drive to. And completely off topic, but this is a funny story. I'm wanting to find a place where I can actually go out there and film. Like, this is what I would like to do. I was trying to talk to my friend into doing this with me, and there was a property that we were talking about going to, and he said, "What happens if we actually find something?"
Yeah.
So I don't know what the plan will be for that.
Right.
But hey, at least I have proof.
You're you get into this area down here and you get around the Hoosier National Forestry, you'll be in the limestone karst. There's a lot of caves, a lot of protected land. There's trailheads everywhere. The Hoosier National Forestry is massive. Easily, I'll give you an example. So Crawford County, where I work at, Patoka Lake's over there, and of course it's surrounded by Indiana DNR, and then that's sort of in the heart of the Hoosier National Forestry, and then there's Tillery Hill Forestry, and then there's Pioneer Mothers Forestry, and a bunch of these other forestries around between Orange County and Crawford County. But Crawford County alone, there's only 9,000 residents in Crawford County. There could be anything in Crawford County, and nobody would really ever know. Not really. But sort of on the topic of the loup-garou or werewolves, rouparou, etc., I think, and I think my wife would agree, that the vast majority of that, or the dogman stuff, or whatever anybody wants to put their finger on it, from our experience that we had here on our farm several years ago, most of it is trickster spirit stuff. And I think that it is very intimately connected to that Southern death complex that I talked about earlier. It's a scar on the land. It feeds off of fear, and it can be anything that you want to imagine it can be. We've heard so many stories about, people finding weird tracks, people seeing big dog-like creatures, people seeing Bigfoot, people seeing UFOs, and they're all part of the same story, including the stories of what we experienced here on our farm, which I am more determined than ever that that's exactly what it was some sort of trickster. And when we showed that we weren't afraid of it anymore and weren't going to feed it any fear anymore, it stopped bothering us.
It still bothers the neighbors sometimes.
It still bothers my dad sometimes.
I know.
But yes.
What did it look like to you guys?
That was the funny thing. I
never saw it because at the time I was working off of the farm. It was before we got married, and he was farming at the time, so he was here all the time. I never physically saw it. All the things that I experienced were auditory phenomenon, or like the things that we saw after the fact things, the tracks, the marks on the trees, the weird stacking of the wood in the stove, and the auditory things. But go ahead, Alan.
There was all kinds of weird things involved. So there were were local sightings of mountain lions, but that just, sort of disappeared into nothingness. Local sightings of big black cats, UFO sightings, basically orange balls of lights. Um, the tracks were very much of a very large canine persuasion, much larger than any dog or wolf you could possibly imagine. There was, as crazy as it sounds, and it's still weird for me to even say it, there was an incident that involved a what, for all intents and purposes, looked like a Cessna airplane um, in our half-mile long driveway that
Was it like 1 or 2 in the morning?
yeah,
we're coming back from my house.
had no I mean, it had a cockpit and everything, but there was no one in it, and it didn't have to it just took off from the ground, just straight up and then gone.
That's a weird one.
It was a very weird one. It definitely was, and it made me question my own reality and sanity for a while. But we weren't the only ones experiencing these things. It was also the neighbors and our my parents, and later we found out that a friend had some experiences that what the thing that he saw looked very much like what you might consider like a pan-like figure or like a goat man or something of that nature. And then we just had a very good friend of ours, a descendant of the McCoy and Wolf distilling families of Orange County that I've done a lot of research on. She grew up over in the Hoosier National Forestry, and she told us some stories that are very, very similar that we just put out for our Halloween episode of If You Have Ghosts, about things that she experienced when she was a kid involving a light hovering over her house and it getting incredibly hot, and a ritual circle and screams from the woods. And the weird thing is, so I'll give you an example of like what we went through. So, and I guess I could tell you like the short version of that story because it's kind of a convoluted and complicated story.
It took place over what, 3
It was
years?
about 3
Like
years,
the
roughly.
biggest part of it was 3 years.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to clear my throat, but the long and short of it is, so we have a neighbor that is, he's a good old boy, is what he is, and he's up there in age now, but he's not one for shenanigans of any kind. If you were to ask him to his face if he believed in the supernatural, he might say yes, but then he wouldn't say anything else. He's a farm boy. He's raised cattle his whole life. He's been a mechanic his whole life, etc. And in the fall of one year, when I was farming full time, we had 2 greenhouses that I kept heated because we were raising tomatoes through the wintertime and various other crops. And he, on the back corner of his farm, where it meets our farm and 2 other neighbors, there's no houses back there or anything. It's a pretty rural area. He had planted a little, I guess like a hunting stand of sorghum, basically. And he called one night, and we had heard some weird things in the woods. And when I say we heard some weird things in the woods, like we heard like some growling, and we'd heard some what you might call howling, and some knocking, and just various little things that you're like, oh, that was kind of weird, but you don't think much of it, right? I mean, there's a lot of things. We're next to an old railroad track. Anything that was caught in the middle of the county as far as wildlife, if it wanted out of the middle of the county, it'd take the tracks. So it's not uncommon to see a lot of wildlife in the area. And we do have bobcats and that sort of thing here. But he called one night, and he's like, and I could tell when I heard him on the phone, he was a little freaked out. And he was like, I kind of need you guys to come back here and look at something. And so, all right, well, let's go. He even said, I'll never forget this because I couldn't believe he said it. He goes, I don't know how to explain it. He goes, it looks like a crop circle. And I'm thinking like he's messing with us in some way, shape, or form, which would be out of character for him too, because he's not like that. But nonetheless, me and my dad went back and we looked at it, and it, for all intents and purposes, it looked like, not like an intricate design crop circle, but like the ones that you see that you're like, something here is off. and I can't put my finger on what it is. The way that the actual crop was bent was at 45-degree angles and in a spiral. And I won't say that they were perfect circles, but something was just a little weird about the situation in general. This was about the same time that his wife had reported seeing a mountain lion come out of the top of the barn, but she didn't know where it went to, whether, and who knows, maybe she just didn't see where it went. Maybe it just disappeared, because we had seen several times, several people had seen a large black cat kind of do the same maneuver. And we even have legends of that here in Pekin. It's called the Pekin Panther, and that's a thing that's existed at least since the 1950s that we know of, 1950s, 1960s. Or in this same sort of time period, we start hearing a little bit more in the woods. And when I say we start hearing a little bit more in the woods, an example would be we had two beagle dogs. One was a lemon beagle, one was a tricolor, and they started getting real skittish at night. And not only did they get real skittish, we noticed that when they were real skittish and they'd come flying back to the house, and I mean, they would hit the door hard. I mean, they'd hit the door as hard as they could. If they could have knocked the door down, they would have, wanting back in the house, and you let them in, they wouldn't go back out all night long. They refused to. And same time that that's happening, we noticed that as they're getting skittish, we could hear coyotes, which are common here, but the coyotes we would hear, they wouldn't come anywhere near the property or the neighboring properties. It's like they were in a circle essentially all the way around the area, but they never would come in any closer. And then one night we got a call from the neighbor that lives down the hill from us, a step cousin of mine. And he literally, I answer the phone and his first words are you hearing this? And I was like, am I hearing what? And he goes, go outside. He goes, are your dogs inside? And I'm like, yeah, dogs are inside. He goes, well, go outside and listen. And so we went out on the porch, and it was me and Kim and my mom and my dad. And off in the woods back behind his place, he lives right in the edge of the woods, but back towards the back side of the woods. I don't even know how you could possibly explain it. It sounded like whatever it or they were huge. And whatever these things were just absolutely going at one another. And I mean, we're talking like
tearing each other
up. And it doesn't sound like normal animals. I mean, the closest thing that we ever found were some of the various Bigfoot howls and woots and some of the dogman calls. And I'm not saying it was Bigfoot and dogman at all. And I'll get to that in a minute, why I don't think it was either one of those. And it was loud. I mean, the sound was loud enough it would vibrate your chest.
Vibrated your chest, and you could actually hear like trees falling.
Yeah, it sounded like they were breaking over big trees. I mean, good sized trees. And I told him, I said, I don't know what in the hell that is. And he goes, well, I don't. He kind of just laughed. He goes, well, I don't either. And we sort of listened to it until it stopped, and it just all of a sudden stopped. And so the next day, being the dumb hillbilly that I am, I was like, well, I got to go out to the woods and see if I can find anything. So I walked back there to where I knew it was at, and I walked that whole area of the woods, and I never saw, and this was in the fall of the year, I never saw one leaf out of place. I never saw anything that wasn't just broken from a storm. I never saw any evidence of any kind of struggle. There was no blood. There was no nothing. And I still don't know entirely what to make of that. But what I can tell you is things only got weirder from there. And because we had paid attention to it, it seemed like it had fed off of that, and it sort of strengthened it. And it strengthened it to the degree that it knew that we were paying attention. And it would wait until you got to a moment where you weren't worried about it anymore. Like, okay, nothing weird has happened today. And then that's when something weird would happen. And it seemed like whatever we wanted to say that it was, because we're human, we immediately start speculating. Well, we hear, was that Bigfoot or was that, something else? And that was before I think I even knew the word dogman. But I know the sound of a canine when I hear a canine, obviously. So the little beagle dog, for example, she got ripped up bad by something 2 separate times. Now, that could have been wildlife or whatever, but it was also on nights where weird things would be happening. And she didn't die. She almost did twice. And we hadn't ever figured that out. Now the older dog, he never had not a scratch on him. And I can't imagine, I saw him roll a coyote that was after her one time. So if it had been local wildlife, he'd have went after it. Whatever it was, he was terrified of, absolutely terrified of. Um, so that never made much sense to me, but if we were, for example, let's say we were watching something about the paranormal, this is literally the way that it happened. It was crazy.
One night I think we were watching like Ghost Hunters Live
Yeah.
or something on Halloween or whatever.
Yeah, we would be watching something about ghosts, and then my dad is in his bedroom. He's asleep. He's got the door closed. It's a new house, a relatively new house. The door there is never opened before.
It was tight.
You had to pull the door tight to get it to close. And we're standing there and we literally see the doorknob turn and the door, and pop and the door open. Well, that's a little weird. And then when I was a kid, my grandfather, said, and I'll say Native American instead of Indian, or however I need to say this here. I'm not sure what is politically correct anymore with this, but he would jokingly say about in the wintertime, right? He would say, I hope it snows asshole deep to a tall Indian. Now, where that come from, I don't know, but it was just the thing that he would say. Well, my dad, for some reason, started messing with the dogs sometimes, and he'd be like, hey, did you see that tall Indian walk through the living room? Well, the dogs never respond to it. He does this though one night, and the dogs point
and watch something walk from the kitchen all the way down the hallway.
Mm-hmm.
And like watch to the point that they're perked up with their ears up and growling.
And then shortly thereafter, the old rocking chair that's in the living room starts rocking back and forth. So that's high strangeness as far as I'm concerned. Now, meanwhile, this thing that's in the woods, we're still hearing it, and we're hearing it more and more frequently, and other weird little things are happening. So we start talking about like the little people. There's a long history of like the Puckwudgies. That was a thing here in southern Indiana as well, amongst the Delaware and the Shawnee. In fact, there's a park here in Washington County, Indiana, that they considered so sacred that it was off limits. They wouldn't go there. And it's the one place in southern Indiana that I will never go again myself, alone for various other reasons. But we started this conversation, and shortly after we started this conversation, I swear, when you say it, it sounds insane, but we heard footsteps on the roof. Like running, like somebody had put their 5-year-old child on the roof of the house, and it ran from one end to the other. And of course, being the good redneck I am, I go get the shotgun and I go outside, and it's wintertime and there's nothing there and there's no footprints anywhere or anything. We go back in and here it goes again. Never do see anything whatsoever.
Saw it that one time.
Yeah. Well, there was a day during the middle of the day, I was sitting at my computer and I saw Kim was at work, and I saw something out of the corner of my eye out of the window over on the neighboring fence line. And the best I could possibly tell you what it resembled as far as things that people have talked about is when people talk about the Ohio grassman, something that looked vaguely Sasquatch, but wasn't real tall, maybe 6 foot, 6'5", something like that at the most. And it was clearly on the fence line.
And they called me at work and told me.
And the crazy thing about it was when I saw it out of the corner of my eye. I looked over, I looked directly at it, and there's no way it could have seen me where I was at, but it was like it knew that I had seen it. And so it slinked down and sort of slinked along the fence line and disappeared along the fence line. And there's only brush there. There's no real trees or anything. I didn't go investigate that one. I just kind of left that. I was at the point where I was kind of done with it at that point. Other weird things had happened as well. So like with the footprint or with the footsteps that we heard on the roof, we were running wood-fired stoves in the greenhouse, and normally we'd have to go out and, throw wood on those about every 3 or 4 hours, something like that. And at the time we were buying these cut off pieces of rough oak. Friend of my dad's, he has a pallet company, and so we get these blocks that are 2 foot long and about 6 inches thick or so, and so they're perfect for stacking up in a firebox. And Kim and I had fallen asleep or whatever, and she left late that night, and I knew that the fires were going to be out, and she would usually check the fires before she went back to her house. And that night I told her to go on because I knew I was probably gonna have to restart them because we hadn't checked them in several hours. It was real cold outside too. And I walked out to the greenhouse and I opened the door, and it was probably 90 degrees in there. I was like, oh, well, cool. I guess I got just enough of a fire to, keep it rolling or whatever. And so I go open the door to the stove, and the stove is 100% full of wood that looks like it has just been put in there, like, and perfectly stacked. Like, I don't stack the wood the way this was stacked. This was stacked. Like, it was like somebody was making a structure. All right, that's weird. Now, at the same time that this happened, there was the greenhouses we had, they're just polyplastic, greenhouse plastic, 6 mil plastic, and there was an inflated layer in between two panels of plastic. And we had something that had, at the same time, there was a hole at the baseboard of the greenhouse
Back by the stove.
Where something had ripped into the greenhouse and ripped through both layers of plastic. Didn't mess with anything. There's ripe tomatoes and everything in there at the time. Didn't leave any marks or anything anywhere.
Went out the way it came in.
Yeah, and went right back out the same way it came in, apparently. And to be sure of this, I thought, because we had some cats outside at the time, maybe a cat got stuck in there and maybe it clawed its way out. But the marks on the plastic weren't from the inside out, they were from the outside in. And then to make it even weirder, when I went to the bottom greenhouse, that fire was the same way. It was built up. So now what in the hell, like, is doing you favors? Now you're into weird Irish mythology with brownies and that sort of stuff. So that was all really strange. There was another night where, and it's hard to remember timelines. This may have even been the night that we got called back there to the little crop circle thing. I don't remember, but me and Dad went out. It had to have been because Mike called us about something. But we had heard something out in the woods, and the coyotes were just out. There was a couple coyotes just out in our woods, just losing their ever loving shit. And then something else yelled back at them, and you could hear all the other coyotes scatter. And so I, again, like a good redneck, I got in the back of my dad's truck with a shotgun, and he drove the truck because that's how all good horror movies start. And we go up and over this little hill, and there's a little valley there. And we come over that hill. I see a coyote come running out of the wood line, and we've got the headlights on the truck and everything. And the coyotes, normally they're pretty shy. They'll run off. Well, this one stopped, and it turned and it looked back at the woods, and it started just yapping at the woods. And so I took a couple shots at it. I wasn't actually aiming at the coyote. I thought, well, that's weird. That's just yapping back at the woods. That's a pretty strange thing. And I wasn't trying to hit it. I was just sort of trying to scare it off. Well, I shot within a couple feet of it a couple times, and it just stood there and kept yapping at the woods. And so we drove back in the woods and never did see anything, and it stopped after that. And then there was the airplane thing that happened one night. I was coming back home from Kim's house, and I pulled into the driveway, and there's a long straight stretch of driveway before you get to the railroad tracks. And literally I can see when I pull in, like, there's something in the driveway, and I thought it was a vehicle at first, and get closer to it, and it looks, for all intents and purposes, like a little 1 or 2 seater Cessna airplane. And I get out and walk up towards it and get pretty damn close to it, close enough to see that there's nobody in it. And it literally takes off like a helicopter, like straight up into the air. And then as fast as you can imagine, gone, just zips away. And I'd literally, that night, I just walked back to my truck and I was like, no, not tonight. No, we're not going to think about this. We're just going to let it go. Cause how do you interpret something of that nature? Nobody's going to believe you. And now, granted, nowadays you could look back on that and be like, well, maybe that was a drone. I don't know that it wasn't, but what the hell would it have been doing in our driveway? And why would it look exactly like a Cessna?
Right.
Unless it was something with the government.
How big a cross do you think it was?
Uh, I don't know. I'd say maybe 20 foot.
Maybe. I don't know what the distance is between the train tracks and the.
I don't. The wings didn't reach the train track, so I don't know. I'd have to get a measurement, but it wasn't big. I mean, it was small, like little common amateur airplane that you see,
Well, so they do
basically.
have those drones that are about that size, but why in the hell would a drone be in your driveway?
Right, and this would have been 2008, 2000. Yeah, maybe a little later, maybe 2009, something like that. But yeah, as I remember,
Dad got sick because we would tell him the stories and he just thought we were crazy.
yeah, it was painted, quote unquote painted for all intents and purposes. Uh, red. It was white with like red pinstriping, but it also didn't seem to have any inherent lights on it, like none of the little red light, like strobe lights or any
It
of that.
didn't make a sound, right?
Yeah, it never made a noise. It just when it took off, there was no sound to it. There was no wind. There was no nothing, and then just gone. So I still am at a loss on that one. This all sort of culminated. There was a lot of other little stuff too, but it all culminated one night. There was, yeah. There was. I don't even remember how it started, but a lot was going on, and I had had enough of it, and so I took again, like a good redneck, I took a shotgun outside and down below my greenhouses, which are the bottom one's probably 50 yards from my parents' house, and it's probably another, let's call it 75 yards down to the edge of the woods. And I had a little security light behind the lower greenhouse. I went outside because we had heard something and I was done and I'd had enough of this whole thing.
I was told to stay on the porch because I'm not graceful.
Yeah. So I walked down to the first greenhouse and I could see, like I heard stuff walk out of the woods. And what I saw, I never saw any detail, but I will tell you that whatever they were, and it was multiples of whatever it was or whatever it was trying to appear to be, came out of the woods on four legs and stood on two legs thereafter. And that was about all of it I could take. And I honestly, I should not have ever have done this, but I did it, and I'll say that I did it, and I learned my lesson from it because I went through some spiritual stuff after this happened that I think was directly related to it. But I took a shot at it, at one of them. I wasn't even aiming at any particular one. I just saw that there were several of them in a group, and whatever it was at least physical enough or reacting physically. So when I say I shot at it with a 12 gauge slug, and yeah, so it lets out this noise that would just make your blood curdle, this scream, and then they take off through the woods and
tearing everything up.
Again, just sounding like they're knocking down huge trees and branches and screaming the whole way, and screaming in such a way that you know that it's not some kind of native animal, but also screaming in a way that sounds just human enough to make you feel terrible, but you can tell that that's not what it is.
Right.
And so I had to walk back to the porch. I look at Kim. I said, I don't know what.
I don't know what makes that noise.
I said, yep, go back in the house. I don't know what makes that noise. And then after that, the next day, I woke up and I had a moment of, I'm not scared of this thing anymore, because clearly this thing's feeding off of me being afraid of it, and it's messing with me. And I went to the woods and I didn't take any weapons with me or anything. And I looked once again, no blood, no trails anywhere.
We found a spot where a bullet grazed the tree.
Yep. That was it.
But that was it.
That was it. And that was it for the experiences as far as that stuff goes.
Yeah. Anything that happened after that was not nearly as extreme. I mean, we would still hear the whoops and the tree knocks and occasionally rocks getting thrown and things like that. But for us at that point, that phenomenon slacked off drastically. Now the neighbor would call us and say, not not the same neighbor in this story, but his daughter, she would call us like when she was out feeding the bottle calves and stuff and say, oh, the tree knocker's back or the rock thrower's back and things like that. But for us, like only one or two occasions where we've like walked outside and smelled like that weird musty smell that you associate with like Bigfoot.
Mm-hmm.
And like the next morning when his dad would come down to go to work, because they worked together at the distillery, he would say, oh yeah, he was messing with my wood stove, or he was messing in the spare room on the house and I scared him.
Yeah, my dad is firmly convinced that it's Bigfoot. I am in no way, shape. I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that that's what it is or was. I believe that it was the archetype of a trickster. I believe it's intimately connected to this piece of property, well, to the wider area here, not just this piece of property. And I think that it interferes and appears in certain people's lives, not necessarily for a negative, but not also necessarily for a positive reason. But it is a creature of immense power that is there to signal that there is massive change coming in your life. And I should have never have taken a shot at it, like I said. And that's something that in hindsight now I wish I had not done. If I were going to do anything differently, it would have been to find a way at that time to spiritually fortify myself and face up to it in some way, shape, or form.
Do you think taking a shot at it, though, is why it stays away now?
I think that I don't think that that's why it stays away. I think it stays away because of that next trip into the woods, where
That you're
I'm
not afraid of it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm not armed. I'm no longer even mad about it at that point, right? I had such an immense amount of guilt, and Kim knows that. It's such an immense amount of guilt about it that night. Like that was it. I wasn't doing it. And I also had that feeling though, that whatever this is feeding off of me being afraid of it. And it inherently knew whether it was physical or spiritual. And I do believe it was spiritual, but it can incorporate physical aspects. It knew that I was on that farm all the time by myself, because there would be weeks at a time that I wasn't leaving the farm. And it knew that. And there were other little things that would happen during the daytime, out in a cornfield, and here comes a random, small little pebble or rock or whatever. There was always some kind of little something happening. Like it was sort of testing the waters. Some of it is not terribly dissimilar to, what we later found out happened with like Skinwalker Ranch and some of that kind of stuff. That same sort of, I guess, energy or whatever you want to call it.
It's like, I don't know if I'm going to get it completely wrong here, but it's almost like that old god type stuff.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And like I said, just something distinct is distinct about it, in my mind at least, distinctly tied to Southern Indiana. And the more stories that I collect, the more I see that other people have experienced things very, very, very similar to this. And you do wonder to some degree, especially let's say and wherever these things ultimately originally came from. I have my own spiritual thoughts on that stuff, but that's not on me to preach that to anybody. One way, shape, or it wouldn't really be preaching anyways. But I do have to wonder if maybe that Southern Death Complex, and also another group, I don't know if you're familiar with the legend of Prince Madoc, and the quote unquote White Indians here in Southern Indiana from Wales. They were in this local area as well. But I do wonder, with some of the grotto worship and all that stuff, if there's just something here that, maybe they revered to some degree, and when the circumstances are right, and maybe even when it's warranted and or needed, it shows back up and it shows itself to people that need to see it.
I don't even know, like for around these areas, I know you said that, don't know what the correct term is. They still call themselves Miami Indians up here.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's okay to call them that.
Yep.
But I reached out to someone recently because I've had a lot of people tell me that they've encountered something like I've encountered up here.
Hmm.
And the old legends for their tribe was there used to be a wolf people
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
were around here.
And wouldn't surprise me.
They did not respond to me.
Huh. Well, now here's another one. My mom, and I've talked about this publicly, and she knows I've talked about it publicly, so I'll do it here too. After all of our stuff, my mom is, she spent more time on the farm alone than probably anyone other than my grandma did when my grandma was younger. My mom's disabled, and so she was one of the victims of the overprescription and abuse of opiate drugs several years back, and had a lot of real issues. So I always have taken, since that time, I've always taken things that my mom has said with a grain of salt. Now she's got that phase of her life seems to be done and over with now, thankfully. But my mom did have some experiences, or what she claimed to be experiences. And I will tell you this, that shortly after, maybe a year or two, maybe 3 years after all of our stuff, while they were still experiencing things, and I think we were on the verge of moving out, I think, but we hadn't yet. And I'd started working at a brandy distillery in Louisville, Kentucky. My mom, there's two experiences I guess we should talk about there. She swore that she saw what she described as a Native American with a full headdress, which is not something that happened here in Southern Indiana. The full headdress thing didn't. Sounds so much like the Wayne's World thing, weird naked
Right.
Indian man. But he was, standing on the hillside there above the house. And when she first saw him, she just kind of, I guess, initially saw him as a naked man. And she tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring at her. And she tried to talk to him again, and he didn't say anything. And so she went on in the house and looked out the window, and she said that he just sort of faded off into nothingness. Another time she called, and to be fair, she did have a drug thing happen that day, but there's some corroborating evidence of some weirdness to this as well. She called and said, so they live about, let's call it a quarter mile up above where the tracks are at. And about
This was actually just like a couple of years ago.
Yeah. About halfway between that distance is where we had one of our tractors parked at. And she called and said that she had heard, or that there had been a guy and two kids.
A guy and a woman and a kid.
And a kid. Is that what it was?
Yep.
Up messing with the tractor, and that they were on a tractor themselves or some kind of piece of equipment. She couldn't see what it was, but so they had taken the tracks out this time because they were getting ready to turn it into a trail. Or no, the tracks were still there. They were abandoned. That's what it was. And that she went out and said something to them. They took off, and I guess she thought they got on a tractor or something and were going back up the railroad tracks. And so I'm an hour away at work, and I don't remember what you had going on, but you had something going on.
I think I was here because I walked up there and I walked
That's
around
what it
and
was.
looked.
Yeah. And so we called local cops. We called the neighbor.
Right before the got set.
They didn't find anything, blah, blah, blah. But we did find where the grass had been knocked down in the area, but there weren't any, direct footprints, etc. We did find where the battery was dead and a cable had been cut. But the cops, I mean, there's no way if somebody was on those tracks, the cops would, there's nowhere to get off the tracks between here and where they were going. It was just a very weird.
I went up there and I looked around and everything. And she also said she saw somebody down at Alan's cousin's, like on a motorcycle.
That's right.
She goes, "Do you see that man down there on the motorcycle?" And I said, I don't see anything. And I was like, I'm going to take you to the emergency room because I think you're having some kind of reaction.
Right.
And
it could have been all that, but I don't know. It's hard to put your finger on some of that stuff if you don't experience it yourself.
Right.
And when somebody's going through something like that, but you've also been through the weird paranormal thing, like it's kind of a 50-50 chance what it is. So, yeah, that's some of the weirdness up here, and or has been the weirdness in the past anyways.
You'd mentioned to me when I talked to you for your show several months ago that you and your dad had a weird experience while you were driving on your way to work. And it's stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to have you talk about that on this.
We had a couple.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was driving through. Well, there were three total that I know of, but there were the two main ones. The first one was out in the middle of a place called Stamper's Creek in Orange County, a really rural area on the highway. And I've seen a lot of weird things on that highway anyways, but we were out around an area called Millersburg and saw something run out in front of the car. And it was close to the car. Like I thought I'd plastered it. I thought it was, your first reaction going to the middle of nowhere in the wintertime, something runs out in front of you here in Indiana, you're pretty sure it's a deer or maybe a meth head. You never know. But I tapped, right. I tapped the brakes, thinking that I'd got it. And it was like it took my brain a minute to just sort of be like to register. But what I saw looked like, for all intents and purposes, what these people describe as, dog man or whatever you want to call it, but it was translucent in nature. And Dad saw the same thing, but it was such a transitory thing. Like it was so fast and hard to make out any detail, and you could see through it. So, and there was no more to that experience than that. Just, okay, well, that's weird, And then not too long after that, coming through Paoli, Indiana, on the west side of Paoli on the same highway, I saw a dog running. This was funny too, because of Dad's reaction. I saw there was a dog running. It was like a brown dog or a black dog, like a lab type dog. It was running. It was bounding like dogs do. And as I'm on the highway again. Here we go. So this dog is running. It's bounding towards the highway. I see it last second, long enough to tap my brake. The last bound that this dog makes, it hits the pavement and turns into a crow and flies away. And I didn't say anything, and Dad didn't say anything until we got to work. And I was like, I can't remember if I said it or if he said it, but are we just not going to talk about that, or because it becomes a thing, when you're open to those things and you see them, it just becomes a thing that happens. And at some point, I don't know, I guess sometimes it's Wednesday and you don't want to have that conversation.
Well, you know what they say in Appalachia: if you see it, no, you didn't.
No, you didn't, right?
Right. I've heard that one.
If you hear it, no, you didn't.
Right.
No, that was the one that ever since you've mentioned that one, you told me it's stuck with me. Like I, for some reason, visualize. I don't know what it would be other than some sort of manifestation of a shapeshifter or whatever, but it's just strange that it goes from a dog right to a bird.
Yeah, and I heavily identify with crows, and we use crow symbolism a lot in distilling, in our sort of secret, not so secret distilling guild, as it were, and so it has some meaning to me, and I'm sure it was there specifically for me to see, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was supposed to be, other than maybe I think sometimes maybe they're just, you just need to be reminded that you live in a divine world that is a gift.
Right.
So
That's something that I'm trying to piece together too with my own stuff is without diving on into it on an episode or whatever, but like I feel like I'm being shown stuff lately.
mhm. Yep.
I don't know how to interpret it. Like,
Yeah.
so it's like, oh, okay. So as we mentioned earlier, I just try to ignore it.
Well, and I think sometimes you can't put those pieces together until years later, in hindsight. Again, taking the shot at that thing was probably not the right answer because I suspect that it was warning us about things that were coming and about changes in our personal world and all of that sort of stuff. And I think it was trying to spiritually help with that growth, even if some of that was frightening. And even if it was feeding off the fear of that, I don't know that it was entirely, completely, I wouldn't put my finger on calling it evil, and I wouldn't put my finger on calling it benign. I would say that it was there for a reason, and it maybe the reason may have been divine, even if it itself were indifferent.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot that happened during that period of time after that. That's when your mom's addiction got worse.
Yep.
That's when my dad got sick.
Yeah.
That's when you got the job at Copper and Kings.
Yep.
And then we moved in together. And once we moved in together and like we reached that threshold of, oh, we're growing up and, we buried my dad. That's when it stopped. It stopped for us in that way.
Right. Yeah.
It only messed with us one time that I can think of after that, and it was during COVID. And it pulled the mimic move. Like, so Alan and Penny, our daughter, were in the basement. But the last time I had seen Penny, she was in the trampoline playing. And I had the windows open because it's, fall and nice and whatnot. And she lets out a scream like she is hurt, like she has fallen and broken a bone on this trampoline. So I go my klutzy ass out the back door, flying around the house, look for her. She's nowhere to be seen. She's not in the trampoline. She's nowhere. And so I go to the basement and I said, is she down there with you? And he's like, yeah. I said, is she okay? He's like, yeah, she's down here playing while I'm working on Copper. And I was like, okay, so this is what we're doing now. And I banished that thing.
Right.
I cleansed the property. I put a barrier line in the driveway. And I firmly told it that it was not allowed to do that again. It was not allowed to pretend to be Penny or Alan or me in effort to hurt one of us, or I would send it back from whence it came.
Now, I will tell you a weird one. It's not, I don't even know if it's entirely directly paranormal, but I feel like it probably was to some degree. And I have a lot of weird stories and stuff like this, but this is one I don't think I've ever told anybody. So the first great solar eclipse, North American solar eclipse, what was that, 20?
It was
17.
2016, I think.
16 or
Because
17.
we went to, me and Mom and Corey and Christopher and Penny went to Tennessee.
Yeah.
And
So,
Penny she was just walking good.
so I couldn't get off work at the time. I was working over at French Lick, and so I was here by myself and was making it a habit to come home and just veg out and watch freaking Breaking Bad. And if I'm here by myself, I'll crank the TV up. There's nobody here to complain about it or say anything about it. And we live, I call it the trifecta of death. This is where the character of my life comes from, is growing up in between an active railroad, a creek that floods, and a highway.
That's why we have a fence around the yard since Penny was born.
Right. So, car crashes and stuff like that down here, and even fatalities, even in the front yard and stuff. It has happened, and it does happen. And sometimes you even get weird people who are on drugs knocking on your door early in the morning because they've crashed, and that's a whole thing. But apparently there was a guy, a motorcycle rider who sort of, he rode with one of the local bike clubs But he wasn't one of them. He was well liked by pretty much everybody in the community. Um, he had went missing, I guess, for, I don't know, almost 36 hours or something like that, long enough that the police were looking for him. And everybody else had looked everywhere for him, couldn't find him, no trace of him anywhere. They couldn't get him on his cell phone, any of that stuff, whatever. And I think it was either a Thursday or Friday, probably Friday, I guess. I don't know. But I guess they pinged his cell phone. And according to the local police, his cell phone pinged from inside my house. And now I'm sitting outside on the porch. And at the time, I was doing a lot of home distilling, which I don't do anymore, which is federally illegal and state illegal. I don't have any problem admitting that I was doing that at the time. I wasn't selling anything. And I don't think that it should be illegal to make alcohol for your own consumption or the consumption of your family and friends. I'm a big advocate of that. But nonetheless, when you're a legal distiller, and then all of a sudden, I'll never forget to sit on my porch. I got the fence around the house and all that stuff. And I see two black SUVs pull in, just speeding as fast as they can. I see multiple state cop cars all along the highway. To this day, I swear I saw a cop walk out of the field from across the road. And I'm like, well, I guess this is how it all goes down. And long and short of it is, they came up to the fence to talk to me, and we're looking for this guy, and his cell phone pinged from inside your house, and blah 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 blah. And I'm like, I didn't even know the guy, never heard the name before, didn't know who he was. And the long and short of it is, I guess he came off the highway embankment over here, which is about a 20-foot embankment, on his motorcycle. And he rode the bank down, didn't fall off the motorcycle or anything. And you could see where he'd either dropped his kickstands or he'd dropped his foot. What I suspect had happened was he came off the highway and didn't realize there was a creek down here. And he was going too fast to stop. And I suspect once he saw the creek, realized he was going too fast. I imagine he probably tried to lay the bike down is what happened. And so the bike went down into the creek. The creek was dry at the time. The bike was going fast enough that it went ahead, and it actually on its side traveled about 40 feet north up the creek bank. He got thrown across the creek onto the neighbor's property and rolled and died. Now, why his cell phone pinged in my house, I don't know at all in any way, shape, or form. But according to them, it wasn't next to the house. It wasn't on the neighbor's property. It wasn't in the creek. It wasn't in the yard. It was in the house.
Told me that they pinged it in the house.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Did they find it on him?
I don't know. They don't tell you stuff like that. I don't, I felt bad enough about that because he had to have crashed while I was here.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear it. So whatever that is,
Right.
There's that.
I was trying to say something. I realized I was muted because I'm an idiot. No, the pinging is strange, and this is very completely off topic and probably shouldn't even bring it up, but the whole Delphi murders, you guys are familiar with that.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Very much so.
I worked for the state government, and it was the highway department. And this is 100% true story. I'm not a bullshitter or anything like that. I never have been. It was right after this happened. It was actually the day that it happened. Apparently, we didn't know this. One of the crews was sent down to go pick up roadkill on the road that just so happened to be in there. And he had sent a message to the crew leader of a picture of the deer in the back of the truck. So it was just mangled because it had been like hit on the highway.
Right.
That somehow pinged from the towers or whatever. And after they'd found the little girls, we were sitting on lunch and his phone rings, the coworker that's in, and it was supposedly, he told, and again, he could have been BSing us, I don't know, but he got all weird looking and he was talking to whoever it was, questions and saying why he sent the photo, why he was in that area. And then his eyes were all like big or whatever. And he was telling us when he hung up the phone that was the police wanting to know why he was sending bloody pictures to someone because it pinged off a tower close to that area. So my conspiracy brain goes into the fact that if this was true and he wasn't lying, how do they even know what we're sending based off of where it pinged at from a tower?
Yeah. And not only
So there
that,
is no privacy.
yeah, not only that, but if they believe for 1 second that the guy that they say did this is the only one involved, why are they even bothering looking at anything else other than his phone? There's so much weirdness around that case, and I will always go back to this. I'm not saying that guy's innocent at all in any way, shape, or form. What I am saying is when his lawyer talks about that Odinist thing in Indiana, and I have nothing against people that are into the Norse thing other than that there just so happen to be a lot of white supremacists that are into that. And then there's nothing wrong with the Norse thing itself, right? That's them corrupting it. But more importantly, that particular group that he is talking about is very closely associated with the Order of Nine Angles. And if there is any group, any Western terrorist group that people in this country should be afraid of, if they don't know what the Order of Nine Angles is, they should find out about it. It is a thing. It exists. I guarantee you that there are people that you know that are tangentially involved with it or flirting with it. It is, for all intents and purposes, an unorganized terrorist faction just writhing with the opportunity to cause chaos.
I've never even mentioned this, I don't think, on air or on anyone's show, but the guy that they were using to try and get information from, the one that had that fake Anthony shots or whatever, right. I know that guy because his brother or stepbrother was in a band with me.
Yep.
So it was like, ew. After he got arrested for what he was arrested for in general, it wasn't because of those girls, but the things that he was doing. I was like, I don't even want to be like known to be even associated around that person. Like I didn't hang out with the guy. Like he'd been to the band practice a few times or whatever, but like that's just disgusting.
And what's terrifying about all of that stuff too is that as a practical and spiritual alchemist, and I've mentioned this many times on If You Have Ghosts and Elsewhere, but the tools to implement mass chaos via chemical and or biological means, the kind of stuff that these people are really interested in, they're not hard to come by nowadays. You can buy most of them off of Amazon. And I find that frankly pretty damn terrifying, especially once you realize what some of those people are into. So I've talked about that, and I've talked about it lightly like this on a few different shows, and I don't go into depth on it, but I put it out there because I do think it's something, and it is in Indiana. There are definitely people in Indiana involved in this organization. I put it out there because it's something that people should be aware of. It exists. It is a thing, and it's even to some degree in popular culture. So, yeah, if you don't know what it is, look it up and do some research and just, be aware of it.
So I knew the Odinism thing was around, but I didn't know a lot about it. I've kind of done a little looking, but I guess when it comes to this whole thing, if they're going to ping phones, and
right.
I don't want to start digging into it, then like,
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Why are you looking at this stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're going to be sadly disappointed by my phone.
Right. I was like, of all the things that I look into and everything else, I'm probably already being monitored anyway.
Yep.
Just from the stuff that gets put out here on my show.
Well, years ago, about the same time all that stuff was going on, and this is kind of a funny thing. Maybe it's coincidental, maybe it isn't. But I was heavily involved in plant breeding for ecological systems, organic systems, etc., sort of filling in gaps that were lost, there being no native varieties adapted to the wider Ohio Valley that really still existed, etc. And it's a whole nother story, but I was also pretty outspoken in my anti-Monsanto USDA rhetoric with a blog. And I will tell you one of the most terrifying things, it's not paranormal that I ever saw, but we put a hit tracker on our website.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of hits that were coming from the Pentagon alone was pretty terrifying. And let's just say that I got invited to something that was international at the time in France. And for whatever reason, could not go, as in could not get on the plane to go. And never was given a reason for that. And as mysteriously as it happened, it mysteriously also went away. So for whatever that's worth, that's the fun world that we live in.
Right. I don't even know if I have a tracker on my website or whatever. At this point, I don't even care if someone's listening. I guess that's cool.
Yeah, at this point, everybody's said enough at this point that I feel like I'm a lightweight now.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's much bigger issues in the world than Alan over here in the middle of nowhere of Indiana talking about Monsanto messing with farmers. So.
Yeah.
But 2008, 2009, yeah, that was a little different. So
I'm just a small fish in a big pond at this point.
Yep. Oh, there's definitely people that have said things that are much bigger than anything we've said tonight, for sure.
Definitely.
So
we can probably wrap this one up here soon, but is there anything else you want to talk about before we do?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, we've got other stories, but that's something that if you ever wanted to get into a good set of ghost stories, we've got one from a house up the road here sometime that we could tell you if you ever wanted to hear that. And that would be a fun another episode in and of itself, because it would involve a lot of history to go along with it. But no, we appreciate the opportunity to be on here, and for anybody that's interested in anything that we do, the easiest way to track us is through thealchemistcabinet.com. If you're a home distiller, for example, or a legal distiller, or somebody interested in the art of distilling or interested in the occult or the esoteric, we've got a practical distiller's almanac for 2025 that's getting ready to come out. And it has, it's back in the day, every profession had an almanac, right? Mm-hmm. Now there were farmers' almanacs, planters' almanacs, all that sort of stuff, mechanics' almanacs. But in our research, no one had ever done a distiller's almanac, so we did that. And it's not just a distiller's almanac. There will be predictions, not of weather, but of potential future events in that almanac from our friend Jace and from Kim, and probably from myself and maybe Chucky Danger. I don't know. We still got to track Chucky down on that and see. There's recipes in there for home distilling, but also recipes for different medicines. There's fairy tales in there. There's all the moon phases, the sun signs, and all the standard stuff you'd find in an almanac. There's also, a little cunning folk magic in there. It's just a fun little actual physical thing that you can hold in your hands that doesn't just exist digitally, and that's something I think people appreciate. So
you'd mentioned before when we talked about the fairy tale, that was something I actually want to talk about at some point too, because I feel like I'm going to have you guys back on a few times. There's a lot of things that we can talk about. Sure. And I enjoy talking with you. So
yeah, same here. And I love the fairy tale thing, man. We've been doing that for, if you have Ghost, and people, whenever the show comes out, people can go back and check out the two spooky seasons. I'll tell him hold on, the two spooky seasons that we do in October, which is literally just my excuse to read fairy tales and poems and stuff like that. And there's a lot you can learn from fairy tales. And so we taught. I have to tell you, because Kim is giving me the look that I have to tell you. We taught my daughter a lesson about fairy tales and what there is to learn from fairy tales this weekend for her Halloween party. And I will tell you this as a wrap up because I think you'll laugh and your audience will laugh.
Love
Or you'll think we're the worst parents ever, one of the two. So my daughter and her cousins were plotting to try to scare me during their annual Halloween party we have here at the house. And my daughter, who is 9, going on 25, who is very wise for her age, she wasn't wise enough to realize that when she was texting about trying to scare dad during the Halloween party, that the software on her phone would identify that as bullying. And so, you know, it was no surprise to us that she was going to try to scare me in some way, shape, or form. And so I had noticed that something was going on because she kept acting a little funny around me a few days ahead of time. And then she started in on this story about this creepy doll and this weird voice and blah, 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 blah. And so I'm a good dad. I'll play along with it. I'll let you scare me. That's fine. Okay. But she starts in on it. I'm like, mm-hmm. So I let her tell her my story. We were sitting outside. This was the Thursday or Friday before her Halloween party. And she gets done with her story. And I said, all right, well, now I get to tell you a story. So the story I told her, there's an old legend from Vincennes, Indiana called the Good Pumpkin Loop Guru, because a loop guru can be anything. It doesn't have to just be a werewolf. It can be anything. You could be a donkey loop guru. You could be a horse loop guru, and it's a curse, and it's a year and a day, always a year and a day, unless you scratch someone and draw blood from them, and then it transfers to them. So the story of the Good Pumpkin Loop Guru is basically that this guy, this French fur trapper's out and about. He's trying to get back across the White River. It's about this time of the year. It's cold, it's wet, it's rainy, temperatures dropping, river's flooded. He's got nowhere to go. Somehow magically turns into a pumpkin, which saves him from the floodwaters and keeps him warm, etc. Goes back to the village. They don't believe him. They come back. They find this giant pumpkin shell he came out of the next day, and it's full of golden pumpkin seeds. Really cool story. But for her, I changed it because I had a prank in mind. And what I changed it to was the guy was at the river and he's shivering and he's praying to God and hoping that, you know, somehow God will save him and everything. And boy, I sure hope that I don't run into the loop guru I've heard all these stories about from when I was a kid. And then suddenly from the woods, he hears growling and scratching and the bush is moving. And he sort of walks over in that direction to investigate, and it stops. And then someone taps him on the shoulder. And when he turns around, it's a little old granny witch. And he says, oh, I'm happy to see you. You know, maybe I could come stay with you. And she says to him, well, where I'm going, you can't go, but let me give you something. And he holds out his hand and she drops a pumpkin seed into his hand and scratches his wrist. And when he looks back up, she's gone. Shortly thereafter, he's transformed into a pumpkin to protect him from the weather and the wind and the rain and the floods. But what he didn't realize was that when he transformed into that pumpkin, and it was so comfortable overnight that he was next to a farmer's pumpkin patch. And that next morning, early before it was daylight, before he turned back into a man, that farmer came through and he was looking for the biggest pumpkin there. And he just so happened to be it. So I picked him up, took him back home. His wife fixed him breakfast, and still dark in the house. And she starts thinking, well, pumpkin pie sounds pretty good. And let's go ahead and cut this pumpkin up. So she cuts it, and she can't see inside it to tell that there's blood and guts in it. And so she also doesn't notice it when it makes a little bit of a noise, like a scream, because she thinks it's the wind outside. And so she serves the farmer the meat pie made out of the pumpkin that was actually a man. Right. And I just leave it there. And already I can tell I've got Worst Parent of the Year award coming here, but it was worth it. So we always carve pumpkins every year, and we had a bunch of kids, and we had like 14, 15 pumpkins. And so I got the bright idea that what I would do is I would make a trick pumpkin, which is easy enough. Yeah, you could fill it with blood, or you could just go ahead and be worst parent ever. And you could potentially put some, food coloring in there. And then, because you need texture. If you really wanted to, a guy could probably go buy some chicken livers. And so I set up my trick pumpkin, and I let them carve pumpkins, and I was carving pumpkins with them. And of course, they're all
the kids the story too.
Yeah, I told all the kids the story, and of course, they're all talking about the loop guru and about how my story's not scary and blah 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 blah. And so I keep putting off the pumpkin I know that's got it in there, and I took just a little bit of the food coloring and put it on the outside of this other pumpkin. And one of the kids is like, "Oh, there's blood on this one. And did somebody cut themselves?" And they're all checking their hands. And I said, for people that aren't scared of this loop grew story, you sure seem a little bothered by it. We're down to like 3 pumpkins. You guys want to you brave enough to stick your hands in there and see what you can find? They're like, "Oh, if you go first." So I went first because I also left the pumpkin guts on top of that one because all the bad stuff was down the bottom. And anyways, the girl that wasn't supposed to get it is the one that got it. But she stuck her hand in there and pulled it back out. And you could tell it really, what's going on here because you couldn't tell how I had done this. And of course, my daughter, the first thing she does is just dry heaves. And I'm like, all right, there's the win. I've done it. And of course, they're like, "Well, you set this up, blah, blah, blah." But then they never could figure out how I did it. And so then when they couldn't figure it out, they got a little more concerned about the loop guru story.
Because I want to taste it. I'm like, "Don't you dare."
And so the girl that found it, she goes back in the house, wash her hands, and Kim comes in with her. And when she comes back out, she uttered the greatest words I've ever heard from my property, which are, "It's all right, guys. It's just food coloring and chicken livers. I didn't commit bloody murder." And so now my daughter thinks I'm the greatest storyteller of all time. She bragged to her friends about it on the phone and all that stuff. So it didn't bother her too bad. But I did ask her if she wanted pumpkin pie, and she said, "No, I'm never eating pumpkin pie again." And then all day yesterday, she kept asking me,
Cinderella.
yeah, she kept asking me, how'd you do that, Dad? And I said, "Well, I took that pumpkin, I put my hand on it, and I said, bippity boppity boop." And she looked at me and she goes, "Frickin' Cinderella."
My kids are not, I could pull a prank on them like that, but I think they're too gullible.
Right.
Here's a funny story. This was a few years ago, so I don't know if it would still work on them today. It probably would if they didn't know it. But supposedly, if you say orange very slowly, it sounds like gullible. So they tried it. So that'll be for anyone out there listening.
Yeah.
Try that out.
Yeah, well, I told all those girls, I said, remember this prank for when you get older, so that way you can pull it on somebody else. But I told them, I said, the right way probably to do it would be, don't tell the fairy tale first. Just let them find the blood and guts and then be like, "Oh, I know what this is. I've heard this story."
Yeah.
So
I'm kind of my daughter, they were cleaning out the guts from the pumpkin from the carved the other day, and she was grossed out by it. And I was like, "Don't feel bad. I'm kind of grossed out by it too." Like that's just been me in general. Like for some reason, like pumpkin guts, when I've helped clean it out before, I'm just like, ew. I just don't like pumpkin. So
right.
I'm a very picky eater. I don't eat a whole lot of fruit and vegetables anyway, so I don't know if it's because it's a pumpkin in general and it just feels strange, but like, I don't know.
Well, now
it
you
is sticky and also astringent.
now you're gonna be worried about that loop guru pumpkin, man.
Yeah, well, if the pumpkin man comes out after me, then he's got
Yeah.
some.
Yeah.
He's gonna get some fists thrown at him.
Well, I hear they're pretty rare.
Old Jack Skeleton over here with a pumpkin head.
That's right. That's right.
Well, guys, we can wrap this one up now, but I want to say thank you for both coming on here tonight.
Absolutely. Thank
having
you for having us. Yes.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We'll definitely have you back on here soon. But for anyone out there listening, make sure to check out their podcast. You want to let them know where they can find it at again?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything. And you can get that pretty much anywhere you get your podcast. I think most people are, Spotify or Amazon seem to be the two big ones.
Apple.
Yeah. I think we're still on Apple, I believe. Occasionally we will even upload, and If You Have Ghosts, I'll do more of this winter, to YouTube, to our One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute channel, with some kind of cool like Indiana video of like a creek or a stream or something, just nice to sort of put on the TV and watch and listen to.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I will make sure to include links in the show notes for anyone listening.
I appreciate it.
Well, guys, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for listening out there, but we're going to wrap this one up, so we'll check you on the next one. And that's the show, everyone. I really hope you guys enjoyed the conversations. If you would like to be a guest on Tinfoil Tales, remember to send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com or go to the contact section of tinfoiltales.com. Just get your message to me. We'll get something scheduled for a future episode. And just remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.
Tinfoil Tales in the headphones. Yeah, it's time to rock. Got a story about a cryptid creature. Let's take a walk. Bigfoot, dogman, they're out there in the dark. But the truth is out there like an alien spark. UFO sightings got the whole world shook. Conspiracies unfold like a story in a book. Media control, trying to keep us blind. But I won't be fooled, gonna use my own mind. In history, they don't want us to know the secrets they're hiding, the truth they won't show. Dominate our society, they keep us in chains. But I'm standing tall, it's time to break the reins. Control, trying to keep us blind. But I won't be fooled, gonna use my own mind. In history, they don't want us to know the secrets they're hiding, the truth they won't show. Dominate our society, they keep us in chains.